People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Inflation and interest rates. At noon today, we learn what the Bank of England is deciding our borrowing costs will be. We'll explore that in detail. Also, a new MRP poll shows the Tories collapsing to just 69 seats in the House of Commons. What on earth is all of that about? We'll also explore how the public sector headcount has expanded in the last few years despite the economic circumstances, and an update on Ukraine. All coming after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Tens of thousands of nurses across parts of the UK are taking part in the biggest strike in NHS history. Picket lines have been set up in England, Wales and Northern Ireland in the first of two 12-hour strikes over pay. Staff will continue to provide some urgent care, but routine surgery and other planned treatment will be disrupted. Members of the Royal College of Nursing are asking for a 19% pay rise, a demand the government says is unaffordable. Authorities are continuing their search for 4 migrants believed to be missing after a boat partially deflated in the English Channel. 4 others died when a boat with 47 on board capsized off the Kent coast yesterday morning. British authorities and lifeboat services, as well as the French Navy, were all involved in the rescue operation. The final episodes of the Harry and Meghan docuseries have been released on Netflix, with the Duchess of Sussex revealing she thought about taking her own life. Meghan says she thought to herself, "All of this will stop if I'm not here." Prince Harry describes what he calls an urgent meeting with senior royals to discuss a new role for them as a couple. He recalls it being terrifying to have his brother shout at him and his father saying things he claims that weren't true. The palace has not yet commented on the series. And some security rules on carrying liquids and items such as laptops in airport hand luggage are to ease. The government set a deadline of June 2024 for major UK airports to install new security technology. It'll allow passengers to carry up to 2 litres of liquid in their hand luggage, up from the current 100 mils. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now to financial news first in today's show. Yesterday, we of course heard the latest inflation numbers, down a little but not a lot, from 11.1% to 10.7%. Well, now, today at noon, the Bank of England will release its latest interest rates decision. Traditionally, it has been monetary policy that has been the primary responsibility for controlling inflation, which means interest rate rises. But this government has said they want to create the conditions for lower interest rate rises through tighter fiscal policy, which we would see through wage and spending restraint. The Chancellor has, of course, continually said that inflation remains the #1 enemy that makes everyone poorer. And yesterday he added, getting inflation down so people's wages go further is my top priority. Well, let's make sense of this now with our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan. And Liam, what are we expecting to hear from the bank at noon?
Well, let's put this in context, Tom. At the start of this year, interest rates were 0.25%. They've gone up 8 times in a row, and now they're 3%. This is the base rate the Bank of England uses to lend money to commercial banks. It's the lowest interest rate in the economy. All other interest rates are benchmarked off that, so by definition they're higher. Until quite recently, Tom, we were expecting another big 0.75% interest rate rise, the same as the Bank of England did at its last meeting. But in recent days, I think the consensus has changed. We're now expecting less of an interest rate rise, maybe a half, possibly even a quarter of 1%. One reason, Tom, is that inflation is easing, even though it's still very high. As you mentioned, inflation number for November that was out yesterday was lower than the October number.
Was that what people were expecting?
Yeah.
Were people thinking that inflation's peaked?
Yeah, because the economy is slowing and that naturally lowers inflation. Another reason why inflation seems to be easing and Bank of England may not need to raise interest rates so much is because the pound is getting stronger, or at least the dollar is getting weaker. The pound is now at $1.23. In the heat of the mini budget, it was down at $1.04, much lower. And of course, a more expensive, a stronger pound means that when we import things, particularly fuel, which is priced in dollars, it's cheaper, and that feeds in to lower price rises. But inflation is still at a 40-year high, and interest rates are still going to rise today, just probably by less than we thought.
It's interesting because the dollar is certainly stronger against the pound than it was this time last year, although a bit weaker compared to a few weeks ago. The Federal Reserve in the United States has been raising rates more aggressively than the Bank of England for the last few months. Has that eased off American inflation faster than ours?
So the US inflation number came out yesterday. It's now down at 7.1%. You know, still very, very high by historic standards, but much lower than it was. And US interest rates are higher too. Their interest rates, they don't have a single interest rate from their central bank. They have a range. And the range is currently 4.25 to 4.5. It's a slightly different system from ours, but, you know, still quite a lot higher, a whole 100 basis points, a whole percentage point higher, and their inflation is a bit lower.
So perhaps it's not all of the government of this country's fault that interest rates have been going up. Of course, Liz Truss got a lot of flack for mortgage rates rising.
Interest rates are going up around the world. As some of us said repeatedly during the sort of fallout from the mini-budget, it's not the government's fault that your mortgage rate has gone up, because interest rates and mortgage rates are going up around the world. It was certainly, I think, the Truss-Kwarteng government that tries to do too much too quickly. So for a while, interest rates in the money markets, mortgage markets, personal loan markets and so on spiked up a bit more than they would. But they've come down actually quite significantly since then. The average mortgage rate is now below 6%. Which is lower than it was at the height.
And that doesn't get a lot of coverage.
Of course it doesn't, because it's complicated and you know, people don't focus on business and economics, do they?
Just finally in this conversation, this new Rishi Hunt government has been determined to try and limit the interest rate rises. They think that bigger mortgage rates are politically toxic. People are very over-leveraged in terms of the amount of debt they have. Is the strategy working? Is the strategy of limiting public expenditure, perhaps limiting pay rises, limiting, I suppose, fiscal growth, is that...
Tax and spend, yeah.
Is that making sure that monetary policy, interest rates, are less aggressive?
Well, economics isn't a science. It's always difficult to prove a negative, right, to prove a counterfactual. But certainly it seems in line with logic that if the economy is slowing, then there's going to be less inflation, so you don't have to raise interest rates so much. But slowing the economy to bear down on inflation is a very blunt and very painful instrument to use. Look, no one comes into politics to try and make people's lives more difficult. I mean, you have to be ridiculously cynical to think that. I don't think that, and I don't think you think that, even though we scrutinise politicians for a living, right? But the economy is slowing. The economy is slowing around the world. The US is already in recession. Britain is heading for recession, 2 successive quarters of negative growth. That inevitably will squeeze inflation out of the system. And if the government thinks it makes sense to rein in public spending a bit, or it's not going up as quickly as it would, then that's what they will do. Just quickly, I'll be talking about this throughout the morning, and certainly I'll be here at noon when the decision is made.
Definitely.
One possible blot on the landscape, a possible squall, if we have a big increase in hostilities between Russia and Ukraine, oil and gas prices spike again, the idea that inflation has currently peaked will seem like a bad joke.
Really important one to watch. We'll be talking about Ukraine a little bit later in the programme, but for now, Liam Halligan, thank you for joining us. And of course, stick with us here on GB News, where Liam will be analysing this all throughout the day. Now, inflation, strikes and the Channel crossings crisis are not abating. The highest taxes on record and barely a cigarette paper between the Tories and the Labour Party on policy. Where does that leave the polls? Well, new research undertaken by the pollsters Savanta shows Labour on course for a staggering, get this, 314-seat majority at the next election. Well, before I'm joined by the political research director of Savanta, let's have a look at these staggering results. Savanta found that Labour are at 48% in the polls, the Conservatives at 28%, and the Lib Dems at 11%. But crucially, these numbers were run through what's called multi-level regression and post-stratification analysis, translating those percentages into the number of MPs in the Commons. This is what we can see on our screen now. Labour at a staggering 482, and the Conservatives collapsing to a low that the party has never seen before, just 69 seats. The SNP rising to 55, the Lib Dems on 21, and Plaid Cymru on 4, the Greens maintaining their place at 1 as well. Well, it's the most remarkable projection, seeing the Conservatives lose every seat in the north of England, every seat in Scotland, seeing the Conservatives go down from 360-odd seats to just 69. How on earth has it been arrived at? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Hopkins, the political research director at Savanta. Thank you for making the time this morning. First of all, can you explain what's the difference between sort of a regular poll, a normal common or garden poll, and this special MRP sort of poll? Why is it more accurate?
Well, it's more accurate because it's historically been known to be more accurate. But I think what the MRP model is maybe coming up with at the moment is that it's never really had to deal with Labour leads like this. I think ultimately what it does is it takes a large national sample and then uses a regression model against the census, finding like-minded people all around the country using the demographic data that we also collected in the poll, and then sort of takes their likely voting intention and projects that onto other like-minded people or similar people of similar demographics in each and every constituency around the country. And I think that what we're likely to be seeing with this model is that a lot of people that perhaps didn't vote Labour at the last election are now saying that they are in the poll part of it, and then it's finding lots of those in other constituencies where Labour have historically not done all that well, and then just almost assuming that therefore they will vote Labour at the next election. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we probably do have such eye-watering numbers in this model. But ultimately, for this model and for other sort of seat forecast models, this is kind of uncharted territory. And I think that if you were to hold a gun to my head and ask me, will this happen at the next election, I think I'd probably say it's unlikely. But ultimately, polls, and this is no different, is a snapshot in time. And what we are seeing and have seen for quite a few months now are large Labour leads that could do some very funny things at the next election if they were to play out.
Well, I suppose we are 2 years away from an election, but still seeing that level of support for the Labour Party and that collapse in particular in support for the Conservative Party is remarkable. I suppose an MRP poll is unlike just sort of doing one poll across the whole country. It's almost like simulating 650 different individual polls in every individual constituency. And we find that in this method, even Rishi Sunak would lose his seat.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, what this doesn't do, Tom, is it doesn't take into account some of those constituency by constituency, effects, such as a major incumbency factor and things like that. And I think we saw models in recently, MRP models have suggested that Boris Johnson would perhaps have lost his seat even when Labour were only marginally ahead in the polls. And I think when there have been challenges for Boris Johnson's seat, which is relatively marginal compared to other safer Conservative seats around the country, we've seen that models would suggest that maybe it would fall to Labour, but in reality, the Conservative Party put a lot of resources into those seats, and I'm sure that they would do exactly the same with Rishi Sunak. So I think ultimately this is a projection. It is a nowcast, but I think it is possibly falling victim slightly to Labour doing well, and I think this then extrapolates that across the country and almost gets a little bit carried away with itself.
So just finally and quickly, if you would, Chris, what lessons should the Conservative Party and the Labour Party take from a seismic poll like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think taking the Conservatives first, I think, what I would say about this, and we did one of these in September, which showed a 12-point Labour lead and a 56-seat majority. And I sat at Labour conference in front of a room full of delegates and said, "Don't get carried away. This is very precarious ultimately." And I think that is still the case. There are a number of seats in this survey that are going to Labour very narrowly, but ultimately we have to make the call one way or the other. But they are almost too close to call, frankly. And I think that 1 point either way or 2 points either way, it could see a very, very different picture. It might not affect the result of the general election, but absolutely would affect the size of the majority. And I think 1 point or 2 points either way could really reduce that by a few hundred potentially. So yeah, I think there is a lot of caution with things like this at this stage, and at the same time, that should be the same with all polls. I think in general, the Labour Party would still need a double-digit lead in traditional polling, even with uniform national swing, to be looking at even the slimmest of majorities at the next election.
Well,
and
it is
really isn't that much for Rishi Sunak to try and close.
I'm afraid we've run to the end of the segment there, but Chris Hopkins, thank you so much for joining us and talking through that, again, incredibly seismic poll there. Conservatives crashing down. It's just 69 seats. Well, let's see if things move over the next few months. But, of course, we did mention another news story earlier in the programme. Of course, it's something that affects us all. It affects the cost of living here at home. And that, of course, is the war effort in Ukraine, which continues, with Ukrainian officials claiming to have shot down over a dozen drones during a Russian attack on the capital city of Kyiv yesterday morning. The governor of Kyiv accused Russia of continuing its energy terror against the country. And, of course, we know that the impact of that is felt much further afield, of course. So, what on earth is going on in this battle? Have things retreated to a bit of a stalemate? Of course, the Ukrainians were making spectacular gains just a month or so ago. Let's get the lay of the land now with Colonel Hamish de Breton-Gordon, the former commanding officer for the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological and Nuclear Regiment. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Hamish. First of all, where is the war effort right now? Have things ground to a bit of a stalemate?
Well, I don't think they have. I mean, we are now 10 months into this conflict, which Putin thought would last just 2 weeks. It's very clear that the Russian military has taken a real hammering. 2,500 tanks have been destroyed. We hear only last week that the Russians are taking nuclear warheads off cruise missiles and using them conventionally. It would appear that the Russians are running very low on precision-guided missiles. And it's also very clear that Putin now wants to draw this conflict out as long as possible. We've heard about cost of living crisis and the cost of fuel and the suffering that people are having in this country and across Europe. I think Putin is hoping if he can draw this conflict out, the French and perhaps the Germans will only do one cold Christmas. And if he can bring the conflict out to the middle of next year, we then see the spectre of elections coming over the horizon in this country and also the US. And I think that Putin is hoping that our resolve to continue with the support to Ukraine might waver. And it's absolutely crucial that it doesn't yield, because the other thing that Putin is desperate to avoid is for NATO to get more directly involved in this conflict. So things might appear to be going quiet at the moment, but we know how cold it is in this country. It's even worse. It's bitter in Ukraine at the moment, and fighting in these sort of conditions are very difficult. But this winter is going to be crucial. And if the Ukrainians can retake Crimea over the winter, then we may be in a very different position. But it is very much Putin's trying to draw this out, to draw the energy and support out of the West. And we must make sure that we continue to support the Ukraine to make sure that they do defeat the Russians really as quickly as possible, so we can get back to something like normal.
Is it a possibility that Crimea might well be retaken in any sort of short timescale at all? That would be the most remarkable advance from even the remarkable advances that the Ukrainian army have seen, getting, of course, quite close to Crimea. But, of course, the Russians annexed Crimea back in 2014. That would be a really remarkable stage of the war. Is it your view that it's the Ukrainians' next goal?
Well, I think Crimea is absolutely pivotal. Crimea is vital ground for Putin, and in military parlance, vital ground is ground that is critical to the mission. And if you lose that ground, you will use all means to save it. Conversely, I think before the war started, Crimea was not vital ground for the Ukrainians. As you say, Russia annexed it in 2014. I think the Ukrainian military now it's got the habit of winning, as the Russian army has the habit of losing. So it is very much still on the offensive. One could see, and also the fact the Russian military have performed so badly, one could see it would be possible for the Ukrainians to retake Crimea, perhaps during this winter. They are being very clever with their way they're fighting this war, the Ukrainians, and not telegraphing anything. But I think Crimea could be the key here. And maybe it is the negotiation piece that will get the Russians out of Ukraine. So I think it is in all of our interests to keep a very close eye on it and enable the Ukrainians to be able to be in a position where they could take Crimea. So I think absolutely it's possible. It's focusing the minds of the Russians at the moment, and that's why they want to draw it out. If they can create the stalemate, which I don't think there is a stalemate at the moment, or certainly the perception of it throughout the rest of this winter, then into this period where people are starting to think about elections, etc., etc. So yeah, it's possible, and we need to enable them to do
that is really remarkable. Of course, it was Crimea that kicked back the Russian Empire in the 1860s with the French seizure of Sevastopol. It was Crimea that hosted the Yalta Conference in 1945. It would be remarkable if yet another seismic turn of world events happens in that part of the world. We'll keep a close eye on it, but for now, Hamish de Brecon-Gordon, thank you for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Really, really interesting stuff there on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. But finally today, new analysis from the Taxpayers Alliance has found that the public sector headcount has expanded to nearly 6 million people in this country, with 500,000 more people working in the public sector than even in September 2018. 500,000 more. Indeed, the public sector has grown in size every quarter for 4 years. Is this affordable for taxpayers, especially as we enter recession? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Elliot Keck, the Investigations Campaign Manager for the Taxpayers Alliance. And first of all, did this come as a surprise to you?
I think it will come as a surprise, certainly to many of your viewers. It's a really important rejoinder. A lot of the union narrative coming out from the current ongoing strikes is that the public sector is being really cut back to the bone, and that's just simply factually incorrect. The public sector growth has outstripped private sector growth since 2018, and it has grown by about 426,000 people, bigger than the overall headcount in Tesco. So it didn't come as a surprise to us, but I think it will come to a surprise to many of your viewers.
That's really, really crucial, that the public sector is growing faster than the private sector. After all, it's the private sector that pays for the public sector.
Yeah.
If we've got a public sector that's outstripping the private sector, that's a recipe for bankruptcy.
Absolutely, and it becomes even more of a problem if the public sector are demanding pay rises well above what the private sector is seeing. Just for example, with the nurses demanding 19%, and it's completely unsustainable. And I think one of the big problems for taxpayers at the moment is we're seeing a public sector that is growing and growing and growing and becoming more and more expensive, and yet year on year seems to be performing worse, whether it's waiting times, whether it's border waits at Heathrow, whether it's passport delays, whether it's driver's license. Really across the board, we're seeing taxpayers pay more for less, and that's a big, big problem.
It is remarkable because speaking to political campaigners, you'd hear that the state is being cut back. You'd hear that, for example, the NHS is being cut when actually £50 billion more in real terms has gone in over the last decade. I mean, it is remarkable. The state has grown to the largest point it's been in a very long time. The tax burden is the highest it's ever been on record. Why aren't we getting the results for all of this money?
I think the problem is so much of it is that we are asking the state to do so much at the moment. We're asking it to intrude and interfere in so many areas of our lives, and we're asking it to expand its remit, quite frankly, unsustainably. We've seen the Conservative way forward look at the huge growth in the diversity industry within the state. We've looked at the number of comms officers, for example, that we see across the public sector and the way that that's grown. So I think in so many areas we're seeing the public sector get bigger, but get bigger in areas where we're not actually looking for the state to function. So what we need is a smaller, more nimble, more agile state that does the things that we really, really want, and where maybe actually it is paid slightly better because it is smaller. But at the moment, we have a state that is growing larger and larger and larger with a staff and a workforce that is demanding higher and higher pay rises, and it's just becoming unaffordable.
So in our last 30 seconds on the programme, what is your message to the government? What do they need to do to solve this issue?
Our message to the government is over the next 2 years before the next election to look at what the state should be doing and what it shouldn't be doing, and trying to cut back where it shouldn't be doing, and hopefully in the long term passing that on to taxpayers.
Well, Elliot Keck, thank you so much for bringing us that research this morning. Really, really fascinating stuff there, and perhaps surprising for a number of viewers. Well, thanks again to Elliot, and thank you for watching today. I'll be back tomorrow morning at 9:30, but before then, up next, it's Bev Turner Today.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Monday to Thursday.